Hi everybody, it's Mr. Kearns. I am here to detail and read the text from the remote learning packet number 2 for Global 1, Math, ELA09, and Forensics. This week we've added Forensics to it, okay? Just a reminder, if you're watching the video, you already know to click the PNW BOCES Fox Meadow button, and it'll bring you into YouTube. Teachers, Mr. Ian Diorio, Mr. Colvin, and Mr. Kearns. And our emails are right here, okay? So the theme for this packet is inspiration from the ancients, humanism, secular writing, and the science of the Renaissance. I'm going to start with global studies, and the objective is to explore the geographical and historical circumstances that led to the start of the Renaissance in Italy. Okay, so first we examine the image and descriptions below, and then respond to the prompts. Up here you have the dates, Rome, Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. A couple of images here that Mr. Ian Diorio has for you to remind you of what manorialism is, about the Black Death in the Middle Ages, and the feudal system breakdown. You're going to write down what you remember about these 3 topics right here, okay? And in the product you'll have on Schoology, you'll be able to type your answers right into these boxes, guys. That's why there's no more lines, okay? Second question on this chart is, how was the period when Rome ruled most of Europe different from the Middle Ages? So you have to differentiate the way life was for the people in Europe when Rome was in power and when the feudal system in the Middle Ages occurred, okay? Differentiate between the two. Here's a timeline of the dates, moving up from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, and then a little bit post. We have some information here about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance as well, along with some artwork, right? So, based on the information and images above, make a claim and support it with evidence to answer the questions. How could Europe have changed so much between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance? All right, and remember the key terms here. Claim is a statement essentially arguable, but used as a primary point to support or prove an argument. Evidence, direct support for your claim taken from the images and text provided or researched, okay? Down here, Mr. I gives you a definition of what the Renaissance is and how the breakdown of the word builds up to Renaissance. So re means again, and naissance is a birth, an origination as that of an idea or a movement, all right? And the directions here are to read the definition and then complete each of the activities that break down and clarify the definition. So the definition of the Renaissance is rebirth in French was a cultural movement in the 14th and 17th centuries during which European artists, scientists, and scholars were inspired by classical achievements of the Greeks and Romans, which they became aware of through the ruins of the Greco-Roman texts preserved by Islamic scholars in the Ottoman Empire. So they stumbled upon these texts from the wonderful times in Rome, and they utilized those to dig themselves out of what the Middle Ages, a lot of people call the Dark Ages. Okay, so definition activity 1. We have the highlight here for you to focus on some important information. Was a cultural movement in the 14th and 17th centuries. Okay, cultural movement. Culture, as you guys may know, is the language, ideas, inventions, and art of a particular group of people. So we have our own cultures today. And what Mr. I would like for you to do down here is take a look at the pictures that we have with the acid wash jeans from the 80s. And yes, they were cool in the 1980s. And the bell-bottom jeans of the 1970s here. Give you an example of some of the dress culture from those 2 decades. We had the 90s. I don't know if you guys remember starter jackets and things like that, or if your parents might remember them. We had those. And you guys obviously have your own culture and your own dress code. A lot of focus on shoes these days, I know that much. So you're going to identify one cultural change that you have seen in your lifetime, and you're going to reference the pictures on the last page, okay, to help guide you. So what's one maybe a bit of clothing. You can think about music. You can think anything pop culture. What's one major change in culture that you guys remember? The second question is to identify something from your life that one group of people knew before another because of their geographic location. So if we live in America, we have the Pacific Ocean on our west coast, the Atlantic Ocean on our east coast. We're separated from other bodies of land. There might be an instance where we become aware of something before those other areas do. That's an idea of geographic location. So you're going to identify something from your life that one group of people knew before another because of their geographic location. If you get an idea what Mr. I is going for here, you can see how the Renaissance spread and the ideas of the Renaissance spread. It started from Italy and spread up through Europe. Okay? That's the geographic location of the start of the Renaissance right here in Italy. So we want a real example from you about the spread of an idea from a geographic location that another group may not have known about because they were further away. Because if you look at the picture again, if you are in Africa down here, or if you're out here in Eastern Europe or Russia, Asia, they're not aware of these things yet, okay? Activity number 2, the directions say to examine the map and information below and then answer the questions on the following page, tracing the ideas that led to the Renaissance. Centers of learning and innovation in the Mediterranean world, all right? So each one of these bubbles points to a geographic location. All right, for example, Venice, Florence, and Milan, Italian city-states, were the birthplace of the Renaissance. Okay, and it'll tell you what these other aspects, or these other locations, I should say, were known to have done during these time periods. And you can see the dates right there. So you're going to list the golden ages in the graphic above in chronological order, which means by time. Chron means time. Okay. And then, which civilization's ideas were the foundation for collective learning in the Mediterranean world? Identify 2 examples of innovation described in the chart, and based on the dates and information provided, which civilization's knowledge most directly influenced the start of the Renaissance? Right? Remember to use that chart above right here on page 8. Now we have a little story. Respond to each of the questions below based on the story. We have Mario and we have Giovanni. I'm going to read the text to you guys, all right, to give you a hint. Giovanni de Nowheresville and Mario de Wealthton were aspiring artists in Italy during the Renaissance. The two went to the same university to study sculpture. They had all of the same professors and were both very accomplished students. After their studies finished, both of them went to their hometowns to see if they could make careers out of being sculptors. So Mario's story. Mario lived in Wealthton, a trading city on the coast of Italy. Since there were a lot of merchants in Wealthton, there were also a lot of rich people. Some of the rich people liked to adorn their homes and the city with sculptures, so they used their money to hire artists to create them. Mario became an apprentice of one of the artists who was often hired by the wealthy merchants and bankers, and then some of them asked him to create sculptures of his own. Giovanni's story. Giovanni lived in Nowheresville, a small farming town far from the coast of Italy. Most people in Nowheresville were farmers, so when Giovanni returned, he got a job as a farmer and sculpted in the evenings when he was done working. It took him years to finish a sculpture, and when he was finished, he tried to sell it. But no one in his town had extra money to spend on it. All right. So you're going to answer the question, why did Mario become a successful artist and Giovanni did not? If you guys are having trouble with the reading, just rewind the video a bit and my narration might be able to help you out. Okay? Directions on page 11. Read the information about each of the events that made up the historical context for the Renaissance. Why did the Renaissance start in Italy in the 14th century? Okay. With the images, you may remember these from up top. The fall of Rome in the Middle Ages. After the fall of the Roman Empire during the Middle Ages, Western Europe lacked political unity. lacked political unity, means they were not unified. There was little trade outside of the manor, and all of the wealth was held by nobles. That would be these guys up here. And war and disease prevented growth. It's going to help you answer these questions down here. So Mr. I has a because, but, and so activity for you to do, and it's got to do with the Crusades. Crusades lead to cultural diffusion. The Crusades, which took place during the Middle Ages, though destructive, connected Europeans with Islamic traders in the Middle East, who had access to trade networks in Asia. The Western European interests in the rest of the world grew. So the first question is, there was little economic growth in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. During the Middle Ages, because... So there's little economic growth in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire during the Middle Ages, because. Keep that red text in mind when you see it. Okay? So you're going to finish this sentence, and you're going to use the map down here to help you. Why was it that in Europe they failed to grow economically after the fall of Rome? I'm going to use the graphic here to help you answer that question. All right? The text here will help you as well. The second question, sentence that you have to finish is, there was little economic growth in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire during the Middle Ages, but. So finish it using but, which changes the meaning of the sentence. And keep in mind, guys, there's a hint down here for you. 3, Crusaders returned to Europe from the Middle East with goods that Europeans wanted, so what happened after that? If Europeans wanted the goods from the Middle East, okay? We're going to come down to page 13. Italian and Ottoman trade. Italy was the connection between Western Europe and Islamic empires in the Middle East. After the Crusades, Italian cities like Venice made strong trade connections with the Ottoman Empire. So, why was Italy the connection between the Ottoman Empire and the rest of Europe? And how might this have affected Italy? All right. What causes could have been? All right. Take a look and you see the lines. These are the different routes. If you're having trouble reading them, you have a digital copy. You can zoom in. All right, guys. You can zoom in if you're having trouble reading the text. Okay? Our second because, but, and so activity. We're going to look at these pictures. Nobles, merchants. Trade between the Middle East brought the Black Death to Europe because. Trade between the Middle East brought the Black Death to Europe so. And trade between the Middle East brought the Black Death to Europe but. And then question 8. We're fill in up here. We're going to use the images to fill in the blanks. After the Black Death, blank became the wealthiest people in Italy, not the blank. So you're going to have to put the correct answers in those blank spaces. From here, we start page 15. Trade between the Ottoman Empire and Italian states sparked the Renaissance. So directions. Watch the crash course videos. So guys, you're going to hover over this. You may have to, like me, hit the control key to be able to click on the hyperlink. And Mr. I has the times in here for you as well. These are the time frames you want to watch in the video. You can watch the whole video and then just come back and look at these time frames for the direct answers. All right, these are the 2 videos. Question 9, northern Italian cities like blank and blank became very wealthy through trade because. We have to make this red. There it is. The Venetians and Ottomans were trade partners because. Italy was primed for the Renaissance because. Okay. 12. The Venetians exported blank to the Ottomans. They were usually woven in other cities like blank that were so valuable because their color remained vibrant. That is because they were dyed with a chemical called alum, which was primarily found in Anatolia, located in blank. The Ottomans could provide Italian scholars with many of the Greek and Roman texts they wanted because. All right, you're going to complete the sentences based on the information you found in the video. Page 16 brings us to the Medici family. The Medici family funds art in Florence. Wealthy merchants, like the Medici family, turned their interest to beautifying cities like Florence. They funded artists, architects, and scientists to study Greek and Roman buildings and texts, then to build new Italian achievements. Without money from trade, the achievements of the Renaissance would not have been created. The Medici family gained their wealth from the Medici Bank, which financed merchants in Italy. Eventually, the family came to rule Florence. They funded works of art through the city and became influential when family members became pope, 4 of them, and they married into royal families throughout Europe. Some pictures you can see. And you're going to answer the questions, in this case, filling in the rest of the sentence after the subordinating conjunction because. Wealthy merchants, like the Medici family, helped spur the Renaissance because. Let me use the information above that I just read. What were the characteristics of the Renaissance in Italy? So you're going to identify examples of the characteristics of the Renaissance in Italy and explain why they exemplify those characteristics. Directions. The painting to the left exemplifies many of the characteristics of the Italian Renaissance art. Examine it and complete the see, think, wonder activity. So list 3 things you see in this image. Then think, based on your observations, what do you think this is an image of? Why was it painted? What do the figures represent? Now the text is going to be small here when you're typing, so you'll be able to fit probably about 11 lines. But if you need more space, you can email us and let us know in the email the rest of your answer, okay? Wonder, write 2 questions about the above picture, okay? 2 questions that you have about the picture here. Characteristics of the Renaissance. There's a good bit of text here I'm going to read to you as well. First, we're going to identify examples of the characteristics of the Renaissance in Italy and explain why they exemplify these characteristics. So the Greek and or Roman influence, number 1, corresponds with number 1, okay? So after the fall of the Roman Empire, much of the art and literature that was created by the ancient Greeks and Romans was lost. Because of the disorder caused by fighting between kingdoms, a lack of education for people outside of the clergy, and a lack of wealth to support artistic creation. Starting in the 1300s, scholars, artists, and scientists in Italy rediscovered Greek and Roman writings and art. They modeled everything they did on what they learned from the ancient texts and artifacts. Many of the texts and artifacts came to them from Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire, where the texts had been preserved and often translated into Arabic. Renaissance writers learned Greek and Latin, the languages of the Greek and Roman empires, and studied the style and grammar used by writers like Cicero, a Roman philosopher and politician. In art, Renaissance painters and sculptors tried to match the realistic depiction of the human form that the Greeks and Romans valued. Then the Renaissance artists pushed themselves to create idealized versions of the human form in both sculpture and painting. Architects, too, were influenced by the Greeks and Romans. They studied Greek and Roman ruins to gain inspiration and to figure out how classical buildings were constructed. Renaissance architects then employed these techniques to improve upon them. So you're going to answer the questions based on the text we just read. All right. Where did Renaissance scholars get Greek and Roman texts that were previously lost in Europe? What languages did Renaissance scholars have to learn to study the Greco-Roman texts? And how did Renaissance architects learn Greco-Roman building techniques? Number 2 corresponds with this text, and it's about humanism. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of the art and literature that was created by the ancient Greeks and Romans was lost because of the disorder caused by fighting between kingdoms, a lack of education for people outside of the clergy, and a lack of wealth to support artistic creation. So what subjects that you study in school would be considered humanities? All right? 3, emphasis on the individual. People in the Renaissance celebrated individuals for their achievements. They were especially impressed by Homo universalis, universal people, or what is known as the Renaissance man. Renaissance men were well-rounded and accomplished in all fields. The ideal person was a well-educated humanist, an artist, a scientist, an inventor, a musician, and had impressive physical abilities as well. The emphasis on the individual is also apparent in Renaissance art. Artists studied Greek and Roman sculpture and studied anatomy so they could create realistic and later idealized, perfect versions of the human form in sculptures and paintings. So you're going to identify someone who might be considered a modern-day Renaissance person. Why did you pick that person? There will be no credit given to any student who chooses Drake, and you'll get extra credit if you choose Mr. Ian Diorio. That's your hint if you're still watching the video 20 minutes in. Okay. Emphasis on the individual, number 4. During the Middle Ages, Europeans were most concerned with living their lives so they would go to heaven and not hell. During the Renaissance, they studied Greek and Roman philosophers, most of whom wrote before the Catholic Church existed or before it had much power in Europe. Renaissance writers, artists, and scientists shifted their focus from celebrating God to celebrating secular, non-religious, academic, artistic, and political achievements that were of this world and not the next. The Catholic Church was still a very important part of European culture, but whereas in the Middle Ages most art was funded by the Church, during the Renaissance, artists and writers were funded by both the Church and private individuals. During the Middle Ages, artists created work that was about religious subjects, but during the Renaissance, writers and artists explored both religious subjects and secular topics of their world, like philosophy, politics, literature, and science. During the Middle Ages, most art was in cathedrals. During the Renaissance, paintings and sculptures were created for churches and public spaces. Architecture in the Middle Ages was mostly building Gothic cathedrals, but during the Renaissance, building projects were both religious and civic, which means having to do with the government. Civic. What does secular mean? Based on number 4, okay, guys? 7. Based on the description of the celebration of secular achievements, fill out the chart below. So you're going to fill in information that has to do with topics focused on in art. Middle Ages, then Renaissance. Source of funding, Middle Ages, Renaissance. Where art was displayed, Middle Ages, Renaissance. Types of architecture, Middle Ages and Renaissance, right? And that's going to end your global work. Now we do English. First, the objective is going to be to read Acts 1 and 2 of Romeo and Juliet and complete the questions to enrich understanding of characterization, conflicts, and oxymora. So, your directions are going to be to watch the video from study.com, which you can click on here, and then write the definition of oxymoron in the box to the left below, which is right here. Then read the excerpt from the play and choose your 2 favorite oxymora. Use this information to complete the yin-yang assignment on the following page. And you can see the yin-yang represents equality on both sides, and among other things, but it connects to the concept of the oxymoron, and you'll see when you write the definition how that has to do with the yin-yang, because there's contradictions to it. So you're going to see something like brawling love, which would be like fighting love or loving hate. Those 2 things are in contradiction with one another, and they're sort of equal opposites on both sides, like the black and the white of the yin-yang. So I'm going to read the poem to you, well, not the poem, but the excerpt from Romeo and Juliet to you, from Romeo talking about his love, Rosaline. Here's much to do with hate, but more with love. Why then, O brawling love, O loving hate, O anything of nothing first create, O heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of well-seeming forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep, that is not what it is. This love feel I, that feels no love in this. So from the excerpt, you're going to do an activity a little bit later on. Actually, we'll jump down to this page now. You're going to copy the lines from the excerpt that you like. Okay, then you're going to choose the 2 contradictions and write them here. And when you're done, you're going to place the contradictions inside of your yin-yang. All right? So there should be 2 here and 2 here. Make sure you put negative and positive. And keep in mind the example over here, strong, weakness, jumbo, shrimp, waking, sleep. Those are opposites in the example. And then the question here requires you to read the play. So that's why this is on a page after the previous activity, which is finally, in what ways does this show how Romeo is feeling conflicted about his love for Rosaline? You're going to need to write down, based on what you learned from reading Acts 1 and 2, how Romeo is feeling conflicted, okay? Now, every character in the first 44 pages of the play is going to be input into the character map, all right? So you're going to use these, like Romeo's father, Romeo's mother, for example. You're going to use those to help guide you in placing those characters' names into these correct shapes, all right? I'm going to give you a hint. Juliet goes here, and Romeo goes here, and everybody else is an offshoot from them. All right, do your best with that, okay? Do your best with that. The play can be found in Schoology under the Week 2 assignment, which I'm going to show you right now. Romeo and Juliet, and it's a no fear copy, so there are 2. Let's see if it opens, because the internet just went out. There are 2 versions here, okay? There's the original text, and there's the modern text. A lot of you are going to find it much easier to understand, the modern text. I encourage you to read both, but Gregory, I swear we can't let them humiliate us, and Gregory, on my word, will not carry coals. There's a great deal more inference making needed to be done in the original text than in the original, or in the modern text, rather. So if you need to, definitely rely on this, but you can also read the original and then look at what the modern text tells you the original is saying. All right, guys. So you're going to fill in the character map based on those characters. You're going to fill in the yin-yang based on the excerpt from the play from earlier. And then the writing prompt. Romeo and Juliet are often said to have been fated to be together. Based on this and the information below, answer the questions in complete sentences. Fate is the idea that there is a predetermined plan for a person's life. What are your thoughts on fate? Do you believe that fate is a valid excuse for a person's actions if they've done something wrong? Why or why not? So you could say, if I called you and said, hey, where's your work? You could say, it was my fate to not do the work. If you believe that it's a valid excuse for a person's actions if they've done something wrong. Hopefully that's not your fate, though. Useful sentence stems, as always, are down here. A guide to correct sentence structure is here. Want to see complete sentences? You guys will lose credit for not using complete sentences, not using proper punctuation, not using capital letters or end marks, all right? Let's make sure we write thoroughly. Now we start forensics. The objective for forensics is to understand the history of criminology and autopsies and complete questions to understand the foundation of modern forensics. So you're going to read the article and annotate for key information on criminology. And this text is the history of criminology from the ancients to the Renaissance. You can see right here, I'm going to read that out loud to you. And make sure you keep in mind that the green words here, which I'm not going to go into in detail right now, are available in the word bank at the bottom here. All right, guys? So, as long as there have been people, there have been crime. Has been crime, I should say. Criminology, forensics, is the study of crime and the criminal element, its causes, and the suppression and prevention of it. The history of criminology is in many ways the history of humanity. In ancient times, the common response to crime was revenge. Often these responses were not measured or proportionate due to actions taken against the criminal. Blood feuds often developed that could sometimes last for generations. Sound familiar? The first laws that clearly defined crimes and corresponding punishments were established to both quell crime and to put an end to the blood feuds. These early laws still allowed the victim of a crime to issue the punishment, but they sought to make it more equal to the severity of the crime itself. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the earliest of these endeavors, and it's perhaps the best known attempt to establish a set punishment scale for crimes. The principles set out in the code are best described as the law of retaliation. Many of the early ideas about crime and punishment were preserved in the Old Testament of the Bible and Western culture. The concept is most easily recognized as the expression, an eye for an eye. Crime, along with most everything else, was viewed in the context of religion in early societies. Criminal acts offended the gods or God. Acts of revenge were therefore justified as a means to appease the gods for the affront committed against them. In the Middle Ages, the introduction and spread of Christianity throughout the West brought a return to a religious connection between crime and punishment. Criminal acts became thought of as works and influences of the devil or Satan. Crimes were equated with sin. Kings and queens of earlier times claimed their totalitarian authority on the will of God, taking the position that they had been placed in power by God and were therefore acting within his will. Crimes against persons, property, and state were all viewed as crimes against God and as sins. Monarchs claimed to be both the heads of state and heads of church. Punishment was often swift and cruel, with little regard for the criminal. Ideas about crime and punishment took more secular and humanistic form as the notion of separation of church and state began to take root. Modern-day criminology developed out of the study of sociology. The Renaissance criminologists sought to learn the root causes of crime and to determine how to best address and prevent it. Okay, so you're going to watch an autopsy video, and based on what you just read, remember you can click these links, what you just read, the video, and the images and definitions, you're going to answer some questions. According to the video, name 2 reasons why autopsies were performed in the past. Okay, and you see the image. Not a very happy picture, I know. And down here, we have a timeline of the evolution of forensic science. And in here, I'm going to read this to you because it might be a little blurry, okay? It says 44 BC, the medical examiner of Julius Caesar determined that out of 23 wounds, only 1 was fatal. So Julius Caesar was attacked and killed by a few other politicians and even his great friend Brutus. And they figured out that he was stabbed 23 times, but there was only 1 fatal wound using forensic science. The autopsy is the most iconic forensic breakthrough of the Renaissance era. Its development opened the gates to new dimensions in medical and forensic sciences. Many ancient civilizations like Egypt, Greece, China, and India were well aware of the procedure and used it to study anatomy. The word autopsy comes from Greek and literally means to see for oneself. In 44 BC, an autopsy was performed on Julius Caesar to see which of the 23 stab wounds actually inflicted the fatality. The first legal autopsy to find the cause of death was ordered by the magistrate in Bologna in 1302. It was introduced in Europe by Greeks, but with the rise of the church, the autopsy was attacked as a horrible offense against the dead. Still, some curious minds continued autopsy, but in secrecy. The Renaissance era saw the revival of the practice. The fascinating pictures and accounts of Leonardo da Vinci's adventure with dissection of the human body are well known, 1503 to 1516. Da Vinci and Michelangelo each performed autopsies to understand human anatomy better. However, it was Giovanni Battista Morgagni in 1682, or who lived between 1682 and 1771, who gave autopsy the form of a science. Right? Autopsies are the general tool to find out the cause of death, the medical state before death, and other vital information. They have contributed significantly in medical research, forensic pathology, and helped us gain more insight into human physiology. All right. So you're going to use that information, the information from the original reading, the video, and the pictures to answer the questions down here. What forensics case might the image on page 28 explain? Why did the church attack the practice of autopsy? When was the first known autopsy and what did they discover? And why did doctors perform autopsies after 1682? After you're done with forensics, you guys are going to do some cool math work, which involves the study and application of the principles of the golden ratio to the human body. Use the text and the glossary links to answer the questions that follow. So first you get a definition. The golden ratio, and this is the symbol phi, which is the symbol for the golden ratio. It's a special number approximately equal to 1.618. It appears many times in geometry, art, architecture, and other areas. So you get an idea of what a ratio is right here. You're going to have to write down the definition of a ratio, definition of the golden ratio, what is a rational number, what is an irrational number, and is the golden ratio a rational number or an irrational number? Explain your answer. And keep in mind there's also a little bit of a grammar hint here. A always comes before a word with a consonant sound, and an always comes before a word with a vowel sound. All right. If you forgot the definitions for these, you can use these links, which will take you to a glossary, many different glossaries actually, and you'll be able to find the definitions there. Then when you're done, you're going to start a measuring activity. So you're going to grab a ruler or a tape measure, whatever you have handy, and you're going to measure the following to make sure, or measure the following on your hand here. You're going to make sure you use the same units. In this case, we'll stick to inches, okay? So you're going to measure the length between your fingertip and your first knuckle and place it in A. Your first knuckle and your second knuckle, that length goes in B. And then your second knuckle and the knuckle on your hand here, knuckle of your fist, I should say, will be the measurement for C. Then you're going to measure the length of your hand, base of palm to the end of your middle finger, so here to here, place that there. And the distance from the ground to your belly button, so you're probably going to need a tape measure for that, but you can try to use a ruler. Distance from your belly button to the top of your head, distance from the ground to your knees. Let's fix that, that shouldn't be a capital. And then distance from your wrist to your elbows. All right, and when you're done with all that, you're going to do the same thing for a friend or family member, whoever's at home with you. So place all of their measurements here. Remember, just use the guide. So if you say, which G? G is right here. You can use this to help you understand what you should be measuring. When you're done with that, you're going to calculate the following ratios by dividing the values you found above and write them in the table below. Mr. Colvin tells you exactly how to do that. Ratio 1, ratio 2, ratio 3, and shows you the division symbol there. You're going to place these in the table below, okay? Once you get your measurements and your family's measurement, make sure you find the average. You add the two values in each column and divide by 2. You find the average of the two. Then state one observation you have based on the values in the table above. So see if you notice a pattern of any kind that might be able to help you, all right? The Fibonacci sequence. So what is a sequence of numbers? Use this to help guide you in understanding what that is. If not, you can check it out on the internet and you'll find a quick definition for a sequence. Then for number 9, this is Fibonacci's sequence. Explain in your own words how we find the values in the sequence of numbers. So you're going to take a look at this sequence right here, and you're going to study the numbers as they're ascending here, and you're going to explain how we find the values of these numbers. Do your best, okay? Use 2 numbers at a time, and then sequentially up, and sequentially up, and see how they might have something to do with the number that follows. All right? Afterwards, you're going to calculate the following ratios on a calculator and give the answer as a decimal. These are the ratios right here. We get some visuals of what the golden ratio looks like in nature. Here's a visual here. Here's a galaxy, which also adheres to the golden ratio. You're going to compare the values found above to the ratios that you found in the table of ratios you made on page 32. State your observations below and make sure that you're writing out exactly what you're seeing and you're communicating clearly so Mr. Colvin understands what you're saying. The golden ratio is represented by the Greek letter phi, whose symbol is, there again. What is the numeric value of the golden ratio? Write that here. 13. How does the number compare to the Fibonacci sequence ratios calculated in the previous page? Try to think. All right, try to think about it for a little bit and see if you can come up with the answer to that question. Then we see how this applies to the Renaissance, the golden ratio and Renaissance art. The golden ratio was written about in a work on the divine proportion by Luca Pacioli around 1500. This work discussed the use of the golden ratio in art and architecture and was illustrated by Leonardo da Vinci, and many of da Vinci's works used the idea of the golden ratio, including the Vitruvian Man, the Mona Lisa, and the Last Supper. So choose one of these three. This is the Vitruvian Man, this is the Mona Lisa, and this is the Last Supper, two of which are sectioned off a bit to help you see kind of what we're talking about. And you're going to answer down here how da Vinci used the golden ratio to create these. Okay? Keep the proportions in mind. All right? And if you need to, come back up here and take a look at how these items build up. See how this box and this box are roughly equal to the size of here. Keep that in mind, how the ratio works. If you have any trouble, please email Mr. Colvin and ask him for support on this. All right, guys? That's the end of the packet, and I hope you guys don't have a hard time with it. There's some really cool work in here, so I hope you actually enjoy doing some of it and learning about the Renaissance. Take care.